The desert wind carried the smell of something ancient, dust and dry grass and the faint, metallic tang of fear. A people were moving. 2 million souls, some say, stretching across the wilderness in a column so long that the front could not see the back could not see the front, and somewhere in the middle, children were crying and old men were leaning hard on walking sticks, and mothers were carrying everything they owned wrapped in linen bundles pressed against their chests. They were the children of Israel. For 400 years they had bent their backs in Egypt, stacking bricks under a sun that showed no mercy, watching their sons dragged away, learning to pray in whispers. But 3 days ago, 3 extraordinary days ago, Pharaoh had opened his fist. A plague of death had swept through Egypt in the night, and in the morning, the most powerful man in the known world had told them to go. And so they went. Moses walked at the front of it all, this 80-year-old shepherd-turned-deliverer, sandals worn thin, his white beard catching the wind, his staff held loosely in a hand that had once trembled at a burning bush. He had seen God in fire. He had spoken the words that cracked a nation open. And now he was leading 2 million people toward the edge of the world, toward a sea that had no bridge, no boat, and no way across. The question hanging over everything was not where they were going. The question was whether they would survive long enough to get there. Behind them, the dust rose in columns. Not the dust of sandaled feet, the dust of chariot wheels. Pharaoh had changed his mind. That is the way grief works in the powerful. It hardens, eventually, back into pride. He had lost his firstborn son. He had wept in the darkness. But when morning came again, and the Nile still ran, and the sun still rose, something cold and furious took root in his chest. 600 of his finest chariots, his army, his horsemen, all of it, pounding across the desert floor toward the backs of the people he had released. The sound would have been terrifying, a low thunder growing louder, the kind of sound you feel in your sternum before you fully understand what it is. And then someone looked back, and then someone screamed, and then the news spread through that vast and exhausted crowd like fire through dry wheat. Pharaoh is coming. Pharaoh is coming. Pharaoh is coming. In front of them, the Red Sea. Behind them, an army. To the left and right, mountains and wilderness that offered nothing. They were completely, impossibly, horrifyingly trapped. And they turned on Moses. Of course they did. That is what despair does to people. It looks for someone to blame. They said to him, bitterly, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die?" They said, "Didn't we tell you in Egypt, leave us alone? It would have been better to serve the Egyptians than to die out here." You can hear the exhaustion in those words. The grief. The terror. These were not ungrateful people. These were people standing at the edge of what they could endure. 400 years of suffering, 3 days of hope, and now this. Moses heard every word. Imagine what that felt like, to carry the weight of an entire nation's hope and then feel it turn to accusation in your hands. He had not chosen this. He had argued with God at a burning bush, told the Almighty he was the wrong man for the job, that he couldn't speak well, that someone else should go. And God had sent him anyway. Now he stood between a sea and an army and 2 million terrified people, and every eye was on him. The water was ahead of him, vast, dark blue, indifferent, utterly immovable. And Moses had nothing. No boats, no bridge, no plan, only a staff, and a God who had said, "Trust me," and the memory of a voice he had heard in fire. Then Moses opened his mouth, and what came out of it was not a plan or a strategy. It was something quieter and more difficult than either. He said, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Be still." Can you imagine being asked to be still when you can hear the hoofbeats? When the dust cloud is growing and the chariots are close enough now that you can see the sun catching the metal? Be still. It was an impossible instruction. And yet something in his voice, something worn and certain and old, held. And then God spoke to Moses privately, intimately, the way the divine sometimes does in the middle of catastrophe, not in thunder, but in a word that cuts straight through. "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water." Moses turned. He walked to the edge. The water was there, dark and cold and real, lapping at the sand near his sandals. He stretched out his hand. What followed, Scripture tells us, was a wind. Not a gentle wind. A fierce east wind that blew all that night. A wind so strong and sustained that the water began to move, to pull back, to divide. And in the morning, where there had been nothing but the deep, there was dry ground. There were walls of water, walls, standing upright on either side. The sea held back by something it did not choose to obey. The water lit by a pillar of fire that burned between Israel and Egypt, holding the army back through the darkness while God prepared a road. The Israelites stepped onto that ground. 2 million people, children and grandparents and flocks of livestock and carts carrying the bones of Joseph, they walked through the middle of the sea, on dry ground. And the water stood like walls to their right and their left. Those who touched the walls, and surely some of them reached out trembling hands to do exactly that, would have felt the cold, the impossible tension of water held in place by nothing they could see or name. When the Egyptian army finally followed, driving their chariots onto that same road, the wheels began to come off. The ground that had held firm for the children of Israel turned against their pursuers. And when the last Israelite stepped onto the far shore, Moses stretched out his hand again, and the waters came back. The army was gone. The sea was still, and the people of Israel stood on the other side of everything. There is a moment, after the great deliverances, when the world is briefly quiet, when the impossible thing has just happened and the mind has not caught up to it yet. The Israelites stood on that eastern shore and looked at the sea and breathed. And then Miriam, Moses' sister, who had watched over him as a baby in a basket, who had waited and hoped across a lifetime. Miriam took up a tambourine, and she began to sing. There is something deeply human in that. When language fails, music begins. When the mind cannot hold what the heart has just experienced, the body finds a rhythm. They had been slaves. They had been trapped. They had stood at the edge of annihilation and been carried through on dry ground. What this story offers us, across the centuries, is not simply a miracle, though it is certainly that. It is an image of what faith looks like when it is hardest. Not a confident, mountain-moving certainty, but a trembling, exhausted, barely holding on kind of trust. Moses did not know the water would part. He knew the God who told him to raise his hand. And sometimes that is all faith ever is, not certainty about outcomes, but trust in the one who calls you forward. The sea does not have to be made of water. Every generation finds their own shoreline, the impossible thing in front of them and the relentless thing behind them, and the terrifying instruction to simply move on, to stretch out the hand, to believe that dry ground is coming even when there is nothing yet but waves. There is a reason this story has been told and retold for 3,000 years, in every language, on every continent, by every kind of people who have ever stood at the edge of something they could not cross alone. Because the sea is real, and so is the one who parts it, and the morning is still waiting on the other side.